The ridge had gone silent, and that silence felt wrong. Desmond Doss crouched at the edge of the escarpment, his hands still shaking from the last evacuation, rope burns raw across his palms. Smoke drifted through the shattered trees behind him, and somewhere in that smoke were the voices, faint, desperate, calling for help. His commanding officer had just told him the order was final. Everyone off the ridge before nightfall. The Japanese counter-assault was expected within the hour. The position was indefensible. Every able-bodied man was pulling back to regroup at the base of the cliff. Doss had nodded, said he understood, and then turned to look back across the cratered plateau one more time. That was when he heard it again, a cry, muffled and broken, coming from somewhere near the burned-out bunker 200 yards east. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of the choice settle over him, like a physical thing. The assault on Hacksaw Ridge had begun at dawn, and by noon the American line had collapsed under relentless machine gun fire and mortar barrages. Men had pushed forward through the smoke and mud, only to be cut down in the open. Others had made it to the Japanese positions before grenades and bayonet charges forced them back. By mid-afternoon, the ridge was a graveyard of overturned equipment, shattered weapons, and wounded men scattered across the torn ground. Doss had moved through the chaos all day, dragging soldiers to cover, bandaging wounds, whispering prayers as he worked. He had lost count of how many men he had treated, how many times he had crawled through the dirt with bullets snapping overhead. His medical kit was nearly empty. His uniform was soaked with mud and blood that was not his own. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and his vision blurred when he tried to focus on anything more than a few feet away. The withdrawal had been chaotic. Officers shouting contradictory orders, men stumbling down the cliff path in a disorganized stream, some carrying wounded on improvised stretchers, others simply running. Doss had helped lower 3 men down the escarpment using the rope they had rigged that morning, a fraying length of hemp tied to the trunk of a blasted tree. The rope had held, barely, groaning under the weight of each stretcher as it descended the 100-foot drop. When the last man was down, the lieutenant had grabbed Doss by the shoulder and told him it was time to go. The ridge was lost. Command was pulling everyone back to regroup. Staying behind was suicide. Doss had looked at the lieutenant's face, young, exhausted, covered in dust, and seen the truth there. The order made sense. It was the right call. And yet, as the lieutenant turned to descend the cliff path, Doss remained standing at the edge, listening. He told himself he would just check the perimeter, just make sure no one had been left behind in the immediate area. He moved carefully through the smoke, his body low, his breathing shallow. The plateau was a nightmare landscape of splintered wood and torn earth. Shell craters filled with muddy water, helmets overturned beside discarded rifles. The burned-out bunker loomed ahead, its walls collapsed on one side, smoke still rising from the interior. That was where the cry had come from. Doss approached slowly, every nerve screaming at him to turn back, to follow the others down the cliff while there was still time. Instead, he called out softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. A voice answered, weak, desperate, pleading. Inside the bunker, half buried under rubble, was a soldier from another company. His leg was shattered, his face pale with shock and blood loss. He looked at Doss with disbelief, as if seeing a ghost. "You came back." Doss didn't answer. His hands were already moving, checking the wound, feeling for a pulse. The soldier's breathing was shallow, ragged. There wasn't much time. "Hold still. I've got you." Doss worked quickly, his hands moving on instinct, tourniquet above the knee, morphine from his last cigarette, field dressing wrapped tight. The man was too heavy to carry, and the path back to the cliff edge was exposed. Doss improvised, using a shattered door panel as a makeshift sled, dragging the soldier inch by inch across the broken ground. Bullets cracked in the distance, sporadic fire from Japanese positions deeper in the ridge. Doss kept moving, kept praying under his breath, the same words over and over. "Please, Lord, help me get one more, just one more." When he reached the cliff edge, the rope was still there, still tied to the tree. He fashioned a harness from torn webbing and his own belt, secured the soldier, and began lowering him down. The rope groaned. Fibers snapped and unraveled. Doss braced his feet against a rock and held on, his muscles burning, his hands slick with blood and sweat. The rope held, the soldier reached the bottom, and then Doss heard another voice calling from the smoke. He should have gone down then. The rope was barely holding together. The sun was sinking toward the horizon. The Japanese would be moving soon, sweeping the ridge, killing anyone left behind. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to descend while he still could. But the voice kept calling, and Doss could not make himself leave. He moved back into the smoke, following the sound, and found another wounded man near the edge of a crater, a rifleman with a sucking chest wound, his breathing labored and wet. Doss knelt beside him, applied a pressure dressing, whispered reassurance he did not fully believe. "You're going home, I promise." Then he dragged the man back to the cliff, rigged another harness and lowered him down. The rope frayed further with each descent, individual strands popping loose, but it held. It kept holding, and still the voices came. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The pattern repeated. Each time Doss thought he was finished, another cry reached him from the gathering darkness. A soldier trapped under a fallen log, a sergeant bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, a young private who had crawled into a shell hole and could not climb out. Doss moved through the twilight like a man in a trance, his body operating beyond exhaustion, his mind focused on a single task: find them, stabilize them, get them to the rope, lower them down. He stopped counting after the 5th man, then the 8th, then the 12th. His medical supplies were gone. He used torn strips of uniform as bandages. He shared his canteen until it was empty. He prayed over men who were too far gone to save, holding their hands as they died, whispering promises that someone would come back for their bodies when the ridge was retaken. At the base of the cliff, Private James Sullivan watched the rope go taut again, watched another harness descend through the gathering dusk. He had been among the first evacuated, carried down with a shrapnel wound to his shoulder that had left his right arm useless. Now he sat with his back against a supply crate, counting. "That's 14, Sullivan said to no one in particular. 14 men he's brought down." A corporal nearby shook his head. "He's gonna get himself killed up there." "Maybe," Sullivan said quietly, "but not before he gets a few more down first." The officer in charge, Lieutenant Gorman, stood 20 feet away, field telephone pressed to his ear, arguing with someone at battalion. His face was drawn, lined with exhaustion, and something else. Guilt, perhaps, or admiration he didn't know how to express. When he finally hung up, he walked over to where the medics were receiving the wounded, watching as they worked on the latest man Doss had lowered. The soldier's face was grey, his breathing weak, but he was alive. He would make it to the aid station. "How many now?" Gorman asked. 16, sir," one of the medics replied without looking up. "Maybe more. Hard to keep track." Gorman looked up at the ridge, invisible now in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, one unarmed medic was still moving through enemy territory, still searching. "Someone needs to order him down," the corporal said. "I already did," Gorman replied softly. 2 hours ago. On the ridge, Doss didn't think about orders anymore. He didn't think about the Japanese positions that must be all around him, didn't think about the darkness closing in, didn't think about the rope that was now so frayed he could see individual fibers catching the last light. He thought only about the next voice, the next man, the next prayer. "Please, Lord, one more." A memory surfaced as he worked, unbidden. Basic training, Fort Jackson, 1942. The drill sergeant standing over him, red-faced and shouting. "You won't carry a rifle, Doss? You think you can just walk through a war zone with your Bible and your good intentions?" "Yes, Sergeant." You're gonna get your whole squad killed. You know that? I won't let anyone die because of me, Sergeant. I'll do my part. The sergeant had spat on the ground. Your part, we'll see about that. Now, 3 years later and 10,000 miles from home, Doss was doing his part. One man at a time, one prayer at a time, one length of fraying rope at a time. He found 2 more men huddled together in a collapsed dugout, both wounded, both convinced they had been abandoned. Their faces showed disbelief when Doss appeared out of the smoke. "Medic?" one of them whispered, but everyone pulled out. "Not everyone," Doss replied. "Can you stand?" "Don't think so." "Then I'll have to drag you, both of you." "You can't." "Watch me." Doss told them they were going home. He rigged a double harness, the rope now so frayed it looked ready to snap at any moment, and lowered them together. The rope held. It kept holding. How was it still holding? Doss didn't question it. He simply whispered thanks and went back for the next voice he heard calling through the darkness. The ridge had become a maze of shadows and distant muzzle flashes. Doss could barely see 10 feet ahead. He moved by sound and instinct, following moans and cries, stumbling over debris, his hands searching blindly through the dark. At one point, he crawled past what must have been a Japanese position. He heard voices close, speaking rapidly in a language he didn't understand. He froze, pressed flat against the torn earth, his heart hammering so hard he was certain they would hear it. But the voices faded. The soldiers moved away, hunkering down in their own trenches, waiting for dawn. Doss waited until the silence returned, then continued his search. His hands were shaking now, trembling uncontrollably even when he tried to steady them. The rope burns had opened into raw wounds that wept blood and clear fluid. Every time he gripped the rope to lower another man, pain shot up his arms like electricity, but he kept gripping, kept lowering, kept praying. "One more, Lord, please, just one more." Night fell completely, and with it came a cold wind that cut through his soaked uniform. Doss shivered as he worked, teeth chattering, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not while there were still voices calling from the darkness, not while the rope still held. How many hours had passed? He didn't know. Time had lost meaning somewhere between the 15th man and the 20th. Or was it the 25th? He couldn't remember anymore. All he knew was the rhythm. Find them, treat them, drag them, lower them, pray. Then start again. Find them, treat them, drag them, lower them, pray. Again and again and again. Below the escarpment, the count continued to climb. 20 men, 25, 30. Lieutenant Gorman had stopped trying to communicate with battalion. What was there to say? That one conscientious objector medic had single-handedly evacuated more wounded than most companies managed in a week, that he was still up there, still going back, despite direct orders to withdraw. The story was already spreading through the troops gathered at the base. Men who had been too exhausted to speak were finding energy to whisper about it. The medic who wouldn't quit, the man who kept lowering soldiers down a cliff on a rope that should have broken hours ago. A chaplain appeared beside Gorman, drawn by the gathering crowd. "It's Doss, isn't it?" the chaplain asked. "The Seventh-day Adventist boy who wouldn't drill on Saturdays?" "That's him. Some of the men gave him hell in training. Called him a coward. Said he was hiding behind his religion." Gorman watched as another harness descended through the darkness, guided down by men with flashlights. "They're not calling him a coward now." The chaplain was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think he'll make it down?" "I don't know," Gorman admitted. "That rope shouldn't still be holding. By all rights, it should have snapped after the first 10 men. Maybe it's a miracle. Maybe it's just good Virginia hemp and a man too stubborn to accept the impossible. Or both." On the ridge, Doss found a medic from another platoon, unconscious from blood loss, half submerged in a muddy crater. He recognized the man. Williams, from Georgia, who had shared his rations during the landing at Leyte. A good man, a friend. Doss dragged him out of the water, checked his airway, felt for a pulse. Weak, but present. There was still time. But Williams was heavy, and Doss's strength was nearly gone. It took him 15 minutes to drag the unconscious medic across 200 yards of broken ground, 15 minutes of stopping every few feet to rest, to pray, to force his legs to move again. When he finally reached the cliff edge, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely tie the knots. His vision swam with dark spots. His legs buckled twice as he worked. The rope was down to its last intact strands, individual fibers visible in the moonlight. Doss looked at it for a long moment, calculating odds he didn't want to think about. "Lord," he whispered, "I know I keep asking. But one more time, please." He secured Williams, whispered another prayer, and began lowering him down. The descent seemed to take forever. The rope groaned and stretched. Doss felt it slipping through his raw hands, felt the weight pulling him toward the edge. He braced himself, leaned back, held on. The rope held. Williams reached the bottom, and then, finally, Doss allowed himself to descend. His hands could barely grip anymore. Twice he nearly lost his hold, his feet scrabbling for purchase on the rock face. But he made it down, one painful foot at a time, until his boots touched solid ground. At the base of the cliff, soldiers stared at him in stunned silence as he collapsed onto the muddy ground. Officers approached, asking questions he could barely hear through the ringing in his ears. Someone handed him water. Someone else wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. The men he had lowered down were being carried to the aid station, a ragged line of stretchers disappearing into the night. An officer tried to count how many Doss had saved, cross-referencing names and units, but the numbers didn't seem real. Private Sullivan pushed through the crowd, his wounded shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages. "You came back for me," he said quietly. "I was the first one. I thought I was dead, and you came back." Doss looked up at him, too exhausted to form words. "Thank you," Sullivan said. "Thank you for not giving up on us." Others echoed the sentiment. Men pressing close, touching his shoulder, his arm, as if to confirm he was real. As if the whole thing hadn't been some fever dream born of desperation and fear. Lieutenant Gorman finally made his way through the crowd. "How many, Doss? How many did you bring down?" Doss shook his head slowly. "I don't know, sir. I stopped counting. The men at the aid station are trying to tally it. Preliminary count is 75. Maybe more. 75 men. Brought down one at a time, through hours of darkness and terror, by a medic who carried no weapon and had been ordered to withdraw." Gorman studied Doss's face, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands, the way he seemed to be barely holding himself together. "Why did you go back?" Gorman asked. "Why did you stay on the ridge when everyone else had evacuated? Why did you risk everything for men you didn't even know?" Doss looked up at the ridge, now invisible in the darkness. He thought about the voices calling from the smoke, the weight of each man on the rope, the feeling of fibers snapping beneath his grip. He thought about the choice he had made at the cliff edge, the moment he had turned back instead of descending to safety. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and hoarse. "I could not leave them, sir. I heard them calling and could not make myself walk away. I prayed for strength to get one more, and then one more after that, and the Lord kept giving me strength." He paused, his hands still trembling in his lap. It was not heroism. It was simply what had to be done. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. 3 days later, the ridge was retaken. Different companies, fresh troops, better artillery support. What had seemed impossible on that first terrible day became possible with rest, reinforcement, and better planning. Doss watched from the aid station as the wounded came down. Fewer this time, the operation executed with the kind of precision that only comes from learning hard lessons in blood. His hands were wrapped in clean bandages now, the rope burns treated and dressed. The doctors had wanted to evacuate him to a hospital ship, but he had refused. There were still men who needed help. There was still work to do, but at night, when he tried to sleep, he heard the voices again, calling from the smoke, pleading, desperate. And he would wake with his heart pounding, his hands reaching for rope that wasn't there. Private Sullivan found him on the fourth night, sitting alone outside the aid station tent, staring up at the ridge. "Can't sleep either," Sullivan asked. "Keep hearing them," Doss admitted. "The ones I couldn't save." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "You saved 75 men, Doss. 75. Do you understand how impossible that is? I keep thinking about the ones I missed, the ones who were calling that I couldn't reach in time. You can't save everyone. I know, but that doesn't make it easier." Sullivan sat down beside him, his wounded shoulder still stiff but healing. "You know what they're saying about you? The men in the companies that took the ridge this time? They're saying you're blessed, that you have some kind of divine protection." Doss shook his head. "I'm not blessed. I was just too stubborn to stop." Maybe that's the same thing. The conversation turned to other things, home, families, the war that still stretched ahead of them. But Doss's mind kept drifting back to that night on the ridge, to the choices he had made, to the rope that should have broken, but didn't. Had it been a miracle? Or had he simply been too focused on the next man, the next prayer, to notice when the impossible became possible? He didn't have an answer. Wasn't sure he ever would. What he did know was that something had changed on that ridge. Something in him had broken and reformed in a different shape. He had gone up thinking he could save a few men, maybe buy them enough time for the withdrawal to complete. He had come down, having saved 75. But the cost of that saving, the weight of those hours, the memory of hands gripping his, the prayers whispered over men who didn't make it, that cost was his to carry now, forever. A week later, Lieutenant Gorman called him to the command tent. "I've been ordered to write a citation," Gorman said without preamble. "For what you did on the ridge." Doss shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, that's not necessary." "It's not a request, Doss. Command wants a full account. Names, numbers, circumstances. They're talking about medals, commendations, maybe even the Medal of Honor." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. "I don't want a medal, sir. That's not how this works. You did something extraordinary. The Army recognizes that. What I did was my job, same as any other medic would have done." Gorman leaned back in his chair, studying Doss carefully. "No, not like any other medic. Most medics would have followed orders and evacuated with everyone else. You chose to stay. You chose to keep going back. That choice saved 75 lives." "I didn't choose anything," Doss said quietly. "I just heard them calling and couldn't leave." "That's still a choice." Doss didn't have an answer for that. Over the following weeks, as the battle for Okinawa continued, Doss became a kind of legend. Men pointed him out in chow lines, whispered stories about the rope that wouldn't break, the medic who saved 75 men in one night. He hated it. Not because he didn't appreciate the recognition, but because the story they told wasn't quite true. It was cleaner than the reality, braver, more heroic. They didn't talk about how his hands had shaken, how he had been certain, absolutely certain, that the rope would break and send a man plummeting to his death. How he had prayed not just for strength, but for forgiveness, because part of him had wanted to give up, to follow orders, to save himself. The legend was easy to tell. The truth was harder to carry, and so Doss carried it alone, wrapped in silence, like the rope burns that were healing on his palms, but would leave scars that never quite faded. He continued his work, treated wounds, bandaged injuries, prayed over men as they bled out in his arms, did his part just as he had promised that drill sergeant 3 years ago. But at night, when the camp was quiet and the stars hung heavy over Okinawa, he would close his eyes and hear them again. The voices calling from the smoke, "One more, just one more, please, Lord, one more." And he would wake with tears on his face, not sure if they were for the men he had saved or the ones he couldn't reach in time. The citation arrived in June, forwarded through channels, typed on official Army letterhead. Lieutenant Gorman handed it to Doss with an expression that was hard to read. Pride mixed with something else. Concern, perhaps. Doss read it once, then set it down on his cot without comment. "They got some of it wrong," he said finally. "What do you mean?" "The numbers, the timeline, some of the details. They're saying I did it all in one night, but some of those men I pulled down earlier in the day, before the withdrawal order came." "Does it matter?" Doss looked at the paper again, at the neat typing that reduced hours of terror and prayer into sanitized paragraphs. "I suppose not." What the citation didn't say, what Doss would never tell anyone, was how close he had come to stopping. How there had been a moment, somewhere around the 40th or 50th man, when his body had simply refused to move. He had been crouched beside a soldier with a gut wound, his hands covered in blood, his mind numb with exhaustion. And for just a moment he had thought, "I can't do this anymore. I have nothing left." The soldier had looked up at him with eyes that were already glazing over and whispered, "Don't leave me." And Doss had wanted to. God help him, he had wanted to leave, to save himself, to climb down that rope while it still held and never look back. But he had stayed, had finished the bandaging, had dragged the man to the cliff edge and lowered him down, had whispered the same prayer, "One more, Lord, just one more," and gone back into the smoke. That was the secret the citation didn't contain, that heroism wasn't the absence of fear or the presence of courage. It was the choice to keep moving, when every fiber of your being screamed to stop. It was hearing, "Don't leave me," and deciding that those words mattered more than your own survival. The chaplain came to see him a few days later. "I heard about the citation. Congratulations." "Thank you, sir. There's talk of a Medal of Honor. First conscientious objector to receive one if it happens." Doss didn't respond. The chaplain sat down on the cot beside him. "You don't seem happy about it." "I'm not unhappy, I'm just tired." "That's understandable. What I did was survive. That's all. I survived, and 75 other men survived because I was too stubborn to follow orders." "That's not all it was." "Wasn't it?" The chaplain was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think? I think you're struggling with the weight of what you've carried. Not just the men you saved, but the choice itself. The moment you decided to stay." Doss looked down at his hands, at the scars that were forming where the rope burns had been deepest. "Do you want to know what I really think about when I can't sleep? It's not the men I saved. It's the man I was when I made that choice." "What do you mean?" "I mean that part of me wanted to leave, wanted to follow orders, climb down, save myself. And I almost did. I was standing at that cliff edge, ready to descend, and then I heard that first cry." He paused, struggling with the words. "For just a second I thought about pretending I hadn't heard it, about telling myself there was nothing I could do, that the ridge was lost, that I had done enough. But you didn't. No, but the fact that I thought it, that I wanted to, that's what I carry, not the heroism, the almost cowardice." The chaplain considered this carefully. "You know what separates a hero from a coward? It's not the absence of fear, it's what you do with it. You felt the fear, acknowledged it, and chose to act anyway. That's the definition of courage. It doesn't feel like courage, it feels like I got lucky, that the rope held when it shouldn't have, that I didn't run into a Japanese patrol that would have killed me, that I had just enough strength to make it through." "And you think luck diminishes what you did?" "I think it makes it less certain than everyone wants to believe. They're building a legend around me, but I know the truth. I know how close I came to breaking." The chaplain stood, preparing to leave. "Maybe that's exactly why your story matters, not because you're perfect, but because you're human, because you felt every ounce of fear and doubt and exhaustion, and you kept going anyway." After he left, Doss sat alone with his thoughts. Outside, the war continued. Men fought and died. Medics treated wounds. Officers made decisions that saved lives or cost them. And somewhere, someone was being written up for a citation that would reduce their terror and doubt into neat, heroic paragraphs. Maybe that was necessary. Maybe the legend served a purpose that the truth couldn't. But Doss knew he would carry both, the legend that inspired men and the truth that woke him at night with trembling hands and prayers for forgiveness. The war ended while Doss was recovering in a hospital ship off Okinawa. The atomic bombs, the surrender, the sudden silence where there had been only thunder. He heard the news with quiet relief and a kind of emptiness he couldn't name. It was over. He had survived. He would go home. But what version of himself would make that journey? The Medal of Honor ceremony took place in October 1945 at the White House. President Truman himself placed the medal around Doss's neck while cameras flashed and officers stood at attention. Doss accepted it with quiet gratitude, shook hands with men who called him a hero, smiled for photographs that would appear in newspapers across the country. And all the while, he heard the voices calling from the smoke. Years later, decades later, people would still ask him about that night on Hacksaw Ridge. How he had saved 75 men, how the rope had held, how he had kept going back. He would tell them the story they wanted to hear, the legend, the miraculous rope, the answered prayers, the divine strength that had carried him through. But to Dorothy, his wife, in the quiet moments when they were alone and the nightmares had woken him again, he would tell a different story. "I was so scared," he would whisper. "The whole time I was terrified. Every time I heard gunfire, I thought it would be the last thing I heard. Every time I grabbed that rope, I thought it would break and send a man to his death. But it didn't break," Dorothy would remind him gently. "No, it didn't break. But I don't know why. Maybe you don't need to know why. Maybe. But I keep thinking about all the things that could have gone wrong. All the moments where one different choice, one wrong step, and everything would have ended differently. But they didn't. You made the right choices. You saved those men. I saved some of them, not all of them." That was the weight he carried, even 50 years later. Not the glory of the 75 saved, but the shadow of the ones he couldn't reach. The voices that had faded into silence before he could find them. The legend said he was a hero, blessed by God, protected by divine intervention. The truth was messier, more human. He had been a young man, exhausted and terrified, who had heard men crying for help and couldn't bring himself to leave them. He had prayed for strength and received just enough to take one more step, find one more soldier, lower one more body down that cliff. And somehow, impossibly, the rope had held. In 1967, Doss returned to Okinawa for the first time since the war. He stood at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, looking up at the escarpment where so much had happened. The ridge was quiet now, peaceful. The bunkers had collapsed, the shell craters filled in, the trees grown back. There was no smoke, no gunfire, no voices calling for help, but in his memory they were still there, still calling, still pleading, still reminding him of the choice he had made and the weight of what it had cost. A Japanese veteran approached him that day, an old man who had fought on the other side. They stood together at the base of the cliff, two men who had survived the same battle from different positions. "I was up there," the Japanese man said through a translator. "I remember hearing someone moving through the darkness. We thought it was a ghost. No one should have survived up there." "I shouldn't have," Doss agreed. "But I did." Why? It was the question everyone always asked. Why had he gone back? Why had he stayed? Why had he risked everything for men he didn't even know? Doss looked up at the ridge one more time, remembering the smoke and the darkness and the fraying rope that had somehow held through 75 descents. "Because they called for help," he said simply, "and I heard them." That evening, in a hotel room overlooking the ocean, Doss wrote in his journal, something he had done sporadically over the years, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it had meant. "The legend is easier to tell than the truth," he wrote. "The legend says I was brave, that I had faith, that God protected me, and maybe all of that is true. But what I remember most is the fear, the exhaustion. The moment when I almost stopped and didn't. The 75 men represent something miraculous to everyone who hears the story. But to me, They represent 75 individual choices, 75 prayers, 75 moments when I had to decide whether to keep going or give up. And somehow, by the grace of God, or luck, or stubborn Virginia foolishness, I kept going. The rope held. The men lived. And I came down from that ridge carrying something I've never been able to put down, the weight of knowing that sometimes the only thing separating legend from reality is one more step, one more prayer, one more choice to stay when everything tells you to leave. He set down his pen and looked out at the Pacific, at the same ocean that had brought him to this island so many years ago. The voices had finally grown quiet. Not gone. They would never be truly gone, but quieter, softer, more like memories than nightmares. And in that quiet, Desmond Doss finally allowed himself to believe what everyone had been telling him for decades, that what he had done mattered, that the 75 lives saved were worth more than the fear and doubt and exhaustion he had felt in the saving of them, that sometimes the legend and the truth could coexist, one for the world to remember, one for the heart to carry, and that both were necessary, both were real. Both were, in their own way, the story of what happened on Hacksaw Ridge. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.